The crisp autumn morning at Kennedy International Airport buzzed with the usual chaos of travelers rushing to their gates. Among them was Mrs. Chen, a successful real estate mogul from Manhattan, dressed impeccably in her designer suit and carrying her premium leather laptop bag. She had grown accustomed to the finer things in life, and first-class travel was non-negotiable for her. As she settled into her spacious first-class seat on the flight to Los Angeles, Mrs. Chen began arranging her belongings, placing her expensive noise-canceling headphones and the latest issue of Forbes magazine within easy reach. The cabin crew fawned over her, recognizing her as a frequent premium passenger. Just as she was about to take her first sip of pre-flight champagne, a commotion near the front of the cabin caught her attention. A young soldier in his military fatigues stood there, speaking quietly with the flight attendant. His uniform was pristine, but his exhausted eyes and slumped shoulders told a different story. He clutched a crumpled economy ticket in his hand, and Mrs. Chen couldn't help but overhear their conversation. "I'm so sorry, sir," the flight attendant was saying, "but the economy cabin is completely full. We're trying our best to accommodate everyone after the cancellation of the earlier flight." The soldier nodded understandingly. "I just need to get home to see my mother. She's having surgery tomorrow, and this is the only flight that will get me there in time." Mrs. Chen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, pretending to be absorbed in her magazine. There were 3 empty first-class seats around her, and she knew exactly what was coming. Sure enough, the flight attendant approached her with a gentle smile. "Excuse me, Mrs. Chen. I hate to disturb you, but we have a situation. Would you mind if we upgraded this serviceman to first class? There's absolutely no space in economy, and he's trying to reach home for a family emergency." Mrs. Chen's perfectly manicured fingers tightened around her magazine. "I'm sorry, but I specifically chose this seat for its location. I have important work to do during this flight, and I need my space. Perhaps you could check with other passengers?" What Mrs. Chen didn't realize was that sitting directly behind her was retired General Richardson, now a prominent member of the Defense Advisory Committee. He had witnessed the entire exchange while quietly observing from his seat. The general's weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes narrowed slightly as he watched the scene unfold. The flight attendant's smile faltered, but she remained professional. "Of course, I understand. Let me check with other passengers." She turned back to the soldier, who was still standing patiently, his eyes fixed on a photo he'd pulled from his wallet, a picture of him and an elderly woman, both smiling broadly. The other first-class passengers began to stir uncomfortably, some avoiding eye contact while others whispered among themselves. Mrs. Chen tried to focus on her magazine, but she could feel the weight of disapproving glances from her fellow travelers. A businessman across the aisle cleared his throat loudly, shooting Mrs. Chen a disappointed look. The tension in the cabin was palpable, and even the flight attendants exchanged meaningful glances as they continued their pre-flight preparations. The soldier remained standing, his composure unwavering despite the obvious exhaustion etched on his young face. He tucked the photo back into his wallet with careful precision, a small act that spoke volumes about his character. His hands, calloused from service, handled the worn leather wallet with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with his military bearing. Meanwhile, General Richardson observed the situation with growing interest. He had spent decades in the service and had seen countless similar scenarios play out. But this one felt different. It was an opportunity to teach a valuable lesson about privilege, respect, and the true meaning of service. Mrs. Chen's laptop chimed with an incoming email, breaking the tense silence. She opened it, trying to lose herself in work rather than acknowledge the uncomfortable situation she had created. But the words on her screen blurred as the soldier's quiet dignity and mission to reach his ailing mother kept intruding on her thoughts. As the boarding process continued, General Richardson made a subtle gesture to the flight attendant. She approached his seat, leaning in to hear his quiet words. The general's voice, though soft, carried the weight of decades of command. "Tell me more about this soldier's situation. he requested, his eyes never leaving the young man who still stood patiently at the front of the cabin. The flight attendant explained in hushed tones about the cancelled flight, the soldier's mother's urgent surgery, and his desperate need to reach home. What happened next sent ripples through the first-class cabin. General Richardson stood up, his tall frame commanding immediate attention. He walked toward the soldier, who instantly straightened his posture upon recognizing the retired general's distinctive bearing. "At ease, son," the general said warmly, extending his hand. "I couldn't help but overhear your situation. Tell me about your mother." The soldier's eyes softened at the mention of his mother. "Sir, she's having heart surgery tomorrow morning in San Francisco. She raised me alone after my father was killed in action overseas. I just finished my deployment and received emergency leave to be with her." Mrs. Chen found herself unable to pretend to read her magazine any longer. Despite her best efforts to appear engrossed in its pages, every word of their conversation reached her ears. She noticed how the soldier's voice cracked slightly when mentioning his father, though he maintained his composure. The general nodded thoughtfully, then turned to address the entire first-class cabin. His voice, though not loud, commanded attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for interrupting your flight preparations, but I believe we have an opportunity here today. An opportunity to show what Americans are truly made of." Mrs. Chen felt her cheeks grow warm as the general's gaze briefly met hers. She busied herself with her phone, trying to avoid the mounting tension in the cabin. "This young man," the general continued, "has spent the last 9 months in a combat zone, protecting the very freedoms that allow us to travel in comfort today. Now he's racing against time to reach his mother's bedside. I find myself wondering, what kind of people would we be if we couldn't make room for him?" The cabin fell silent. Even the flight attendants paused their preparations, moved by the general's words. A businessman in the front row cleared his throat and began gathering his things. "Sir," he addressed the general, "please take my seat. I can move to economy." But the general raised his hand. "That won't be necessary." He turned to Mrs. Chen, who was now staring intently at her blank phone screen. "Sometimes, ma'am, the true measure of success isn't in what we have, but in what we're willing to give up for others." Mrs. Chen's fingers trembled slightly as she finally looked up. The general's words had struck a chord she hadn't expected. In that moment, she saw not just a soldier, but someone's son rushing to his mother's side. She thought about her own son, away at college, and how she would want someone to help him in a similar situation. The other passengers watched in silence as emotions played across Mrs. Chen's face. The soldier remained standing, his dignity intact despite the unfolding drama. He hadn't asked for special treatment, his humility in the face of adversity only magnified the power of the moment. Then, from her designer handbag, Mrs. Chen pulled out a small silver frame, a photo of her own family. She stared at it for a long moment before finally speaking. I apologize," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was being selfish." She turned to the flight attendant. "Please, let him take my seat. I'll move to another spot." The general's expression remained neutral, but a hint of approval flickered in his eyes. "That won't be necessary, Mrs. Chen," he said kindly. "There's an empty seat next to mine. Young man," he addressed the soldier, "would you do me the honor of allowing me to share my combat experiences with you during this flight?" The soldier's face lit up with genuine appreciation. "It would be my honor, sir," he replied, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the presence of such unexpected kindness. As the soldier settled into his new seat, Mrs. Chen found herself immersed in a wave of self-reflection. The magazine in her lap suddenly seemed trivial compared to the real human drama that had just unfolded. She watched as the general and the soldier began talking quietly, their conversation already flowing easily despite the earlier tension. The other passengers gradually returned to their pre-flight routines, but something had changed in the cabin's atmosphere. The shared witness of this moment had created an unspoken bond among them. Even the flight attendants moved through the cabin with renewed purpose, their smiles more genuine, their service more heartfelt. What none of them knew was that this flight would become more than just a journey from New York to Los Angeles. It would become a lesson in humanity, a reminder that beneath our carefully crafted exteriors, we all share the same fundamental hopes, fears, and capacity for compassion. And for Mrs. Chen, it was about to become a turning point that would challenge everything she thought she knew about success, status, and the true meaning of first class. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the first-class cabin settled into a rhythm that felt markedly different from the usual business-focused atmosphere. The conversation between the general and the young soldier had captured the attention of nearby passengers, who found themselves discreetly listening while pretending to be absorbed in their own activities. The soldier was sharing stories about his mother, a high school teacher who had dedicated her life to helping underprivileged students. She never remarried after Dad passed, he explained quietly. Said her students needed her as much as I did. Even now, she's more worried about missing school than her own surgery. Mrs. Chen found herself unconsciously leaning slightly toward their conversation. Her own mother had been a teacher too, though she rarely spoke about it anymore. It was a detail of her past that had somehow gotten buried under years of business meetings and profit margins. The general listened intently, occasionally sharing his own experiences of military life and family sacrifices. "Your mother reminds me of my late wife," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that made several passengers lower their magazines. "She was the backbone of our family through multiple deployments. These are the real heroes, the ones who hold everything together back home." A flight attendant appeared with drinks, moving more slowly than usual near their seats, clearly touched by the ongoing conversation. She placed a cup of hot tea in front of the soldier, mentioning that it was complimentary. Other crew members had been quietly upgrading his service, moved by his story and humble demeanor. Meanwhile, Mrs. Chen found herself in an unusual state of reflection. The laptop before her remained unopened, her pending work emails untouched. Instead, she was lost in thoughts about her own journey to success. She remembered the early days, living in a small apartment with her parents, watching her mother grade papers late into the night while her father worked double shifts. The soldier's voice drew her attention again as he showed the general a worn photograph. "This was taken at my high school graduation. Mom had just finished chemotherapy, but she still insisted on attending every senior ceremony. Said her students deserved to have someone cheer for them." A small gasp escaped Mrs. Chen's lips before she could catch herself. The general and the soldier paused, turning slightly toward her. She felt her face flush but found herself speaking anyway. "My mother, she used to do the same thing," she said softly. "She would attend every student's important event, even when she was exhausted." The ice was broken. The soldier smiled warmly at her, and Mrs. Chen found herself moving to the empty seat across the aisle to join their conversation. "Please," she said, her voice carrying a hint of emotion she rarely allowed others to see, "tell me more about your mother." As the flight progressed, other passengers began to participate in the conversation. A doctor sitting nearby offered advice about cardiac surgery recovery. A retired nurse shared tips about hospital navigation and patient advocacy. The businessman who had initially offered his seat contributed information about a reliable medical transport service in San Francisco. The landing at San Francisco International Airport marked the beginning of a new chapter in this unexpected story. As promised, an airport escort was waiting at the gate, holding a sign with the soldier's name. What happened next surprised everyone. The entire first-class cabin waited patiently as the soldier gathered his belongings, each person offering words of encouragement and support. Mrs. Chen, who had spent the latter part of the flight making calls and arrangements, stepped forward with purpose. "The car is waiting at the premium pickup area," she said, her business efficiency now focused on helping the soldier reach his mother. It will get you to the hospital in the fastest time possible." The general, who had remained a steady presence throughout the flight, stood as well. "I'll be accompanying our young friend here," he announced, his tone leaving no room for discussion. Sometimes having a senior officer around can help smooth the way through hospital bureaucracy. As they moved through the terminal, their small group attracted attention. The soldier's uniform and the general's commanding presence, combined with their quick pace and determined expressions, caused other travelers to instinctively make way. Mrs. Chen found herself keeping pace with them, her designer heels clicking rapidly on the airport floor. The luxury car was exactly where she had arranged it to be, the driver already holding the door open. As the soldier moved to get in, he turned to Mrs. Chen, emotion clear in his eyes. "Ma'am, I don't know how to thank you." She cut him off with a gentle shake of her head. "No thanks needed. Just..." She paused, reaching into her bag and pulling out something that surprised both men, her lucky jade pendant, a gift from her own mother years ago. "Take this. It brought me success when I needed it most. Maybe it can bring your mother luck too." The soldier's hands trembled slightly as he accepted the pendant. The general watched the exchange with approval, noting how far Mrs. Chen had come from her initial refusal to share her space just hours ago. As the car pulled away from the curb, Mrs. Chen found herself waving goodbye, an unfamiliar tightness in her throat. Several other passengers from their flight had gathered nearby, all of them somehow invested in this young soldier's story and his race against time. What happened over the next few hours would become a testament to the power of human connection and the ripple effects of kindness. Mrs. Chen, instead of heading to her hotel as planned, found herself following in a second car. She had called her office in New York and, for the first time in her career, cancelled all appointments for the next day. The hospital was a maze of corridors and waiting rooms, but the general's presence indeed proved invaluable. His military bearing and quiet authority helped navigate the administrative hurdles that might have otherwise delayed them. The soldier's mother was already being prepped for surgery when they arrived. In the pre-op area, they finally met the woman who had inspired such devotion in her son. Despite her fragile state, her eyes lit up with joy at seeing her son, then filled with tears as she learned of the extraordinary circumstances that had brought him there in time. "Mom," the soldier said softly, holding her hand, "these people, they made sure I got here." He glanced at Mrs. Chen and the general, who stood respectfully at a distance. "They're the reason I made it." The mother's gaze fell on Mrs. Chen, and in that moment, something passed between the two women, an understanding that transcended their different worlds. "You helped my boy," her voice was weak but clear. Mrs. Chen stepped forward, fighting back tears. "Your son helped me more than I helped him," she replied honestly. "He reminded me of something I had forgotten, something my own mother tried to teach me about what really matters in life." The nurse came in then, announcing it was time for surgery. As they wheeled the mother away, she reached out and caught Mrs. Chen's hand. "Stay with him?" she asked, mother's worry evident in her eyes. "He pretends to be strong, but he shouldn't be alone." Mrs. Chen found herself nodding, unable to speak. The general placed a supportive hand on the soldier's shoulder as they watched the gurney disappear through the double doors. The next few hours would be crucial. In the waiting room, other families in similar situations were drawn to their small group. The general shared stories of hope and resilience from his years of service, while Mrs. Chen ordered food for everyone, ensuring no one had to leave their vigil for meals. As the hours passed, Mrs. Chen received messages from her office about important meetings and decisions waiting for her attention. For the first time in her career, she found herself responding with a simple, "Handle it without me." Her presence was needed here, in this hospital waiting room, supporting a soldier who had taught her more about dignity and grace in a few hours than she had learned in years of boardroom negotiations. The businessmen from their flight appeared in the waiting room shortly after noon, carrying coffee for everyone. He had rescheduled his own meetings, he explained, because some things were more important than business. Other passengers from their flight began showing up throughout the afternoon, each bringing something: snacks, magazines, words of encouragement. What had started as a confrontation over a first-class seat had evolved into something profound, a reminder that beneath the trappings of success and status, we are all connected by our shared humanity. As they waited for news from the operating room, Mrs. Chen realized that she was experiencing something she had lost sight of in her pursuit of success: the simple, powerful act of being present for another human being in their time of need. The surgery stretched into its 5th hour. The waiting room had become a makeshift community, with the soldier at its center. Mrs. Chen had long since abandoned her usual poised demeanor, her designer jacket draped over a chair as she sat cross-legged on the floor, sharing photos with a young girl whose grandmother was also in surgery. The general maintained his quiet vigilance, occasionally stepping out to make calls to his military contacts. He'd arranged for the soldier's leave to be extended, ensuring he wouldn't have to worry about returning to duty immediately. Each time he returned to the waiting room, he brought updates about the growing number of people invested in their story. "The base commander sends his regards," he told the soldier during one such return. "And he's arranged for some help with your mother's recovery care." The young man's eyes filled with tears of gratitude, quickly blinked away. Mrs. Chen watched this exchange, reflecting on how differently her day had turned out from what she'd planned. Her phone had stopped buzzing hours ago, her office had finally accepted that she was serious about stepping away. In her wallet, she found herself looking at an old photo she usually kept hidden, herself as a young girl, sitting on her mother's lap as they both laughed at something long forgotten. Around mid-afternoon, an unexpected visitor arrived, the flight attendant from their plane. She had switched her schedule to have a longer layover in San Francisco, wanting to check on the soldier and his mother. She brought with her cards signed by the entire flight crew and several passengers from economy class who had heard the story. "Everyone's pulling for your mom," she told the soldier, her uniform slightly wrinkled from her rush to reach the hospital. "Even the pilot asked me to let him know how things turn out." The businessman who had stayed was on his laptop, not working on his usual spreadsheets, but researching cardiac rehabilitation programs in the area. He had connections with several healthcare companies and was quietly making calls during breaks in his research. Just as the waiting room clock ticked past 4 p.m., the surgeon appeared, still in his scrubs. Everyone in the room held their breath as he approached their group. The soldier stood, his military bearing warring with his obvious anxiety. Mrs. Chen and the general flanked him instinctively, offering silent support. "The surgery was successful," the surgeon announced with a tired smile. "It was more complicated than we initially anticipated, which is why it took longer, but your mother pulled through beautifully. She's got a fighting spirit." The collective release of tension in the room was palpable. The soldier's composure finally broke as he accepted handshakes and hugs from everyone around him. Mrs. Chen found herself crying openly, not caring about her smeared mascara or professional image. "When can I see her?" the soldier asked, his voice rough with emotion. "She's in recovery now," the surgeon explained. "Give us about an hour to get her settled in her room, and then you can visit. She's going to need some serious rest and care during her recovery, but I'm optimistic about her prognosis." The general stepped forward. "The care has been arranged," he said firmly. "We've got a rotation of volunteers from the base, and some of her former students have already reached out offering to help." Mrs. Chen cleared her throat. "And I've taken the liberty of arranging for a professional home care nurse for the first few weeks," she added. When the soldier began to protest, she held up her hand. "Please. Let me do this. Consider it an investment in education. All those future students your mother will be able to help once she's recovered." The businessman closed his laptop with a satisfied smile. "And I've found 3 excellent cardiac rehab programs within easy distance of your mother's home. All of them have agreed to work with her schedule once she's ready to return to teaching." The flight attendant wiped tears from her eyes. "The airline crew has started a meal train," she added. You won't have to worry about cooking for at least the first month." The soldier looked around the room, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support from what had been strangers just hours ago. "I don't know what to say," he managed finally. "This morning, I was just trying to get home, and now. Now you have an army behind you," the general finished for him, his voice gruff with emotion. "That's what happens when you serve others all your life, son. Sometimes it comes back around when you least expect it." Mrs. Chen thought about her initial reaction on the plane, how she had almost missed being part of this moment because of her own self-importance. The jade pendant she had given him caught the fluorescent hospital lights as the soldier pulled it from his pocket, running his fingers over it thoughtfully. "Your mother's lucky charm worked," he said softly to Mrs. Chen. She shook her head, her voice gentle. "No, I think we're the lucky ones. Sometimes it takes a reminder to see what really matters in life. Your mother spent her life teaching students, and today, she taught all of us something invaluable." The businessman nodded in agreement. "Success isn't just about the bottom line or first-class seats," he said thoughtfully. "It's about what we do for others along the way." As they waited for the final hour before visiting hours, plans were made and contact information exchanged. This wasn't going to be the end of their connection, they had all been changed by the events of this day. Mrs. Chen found herself volunteering to join the meal train rotation, despite having never cooked a meal in years. The general was already planning to introduce the soldier to some key military medical contacts who could help with his mother's long-term care. The first visit to the recovery room was limited to just the soldier, but the group waited nearby, their collective anxiety now replaced with hopeful anticipation. Through the window, they could see the tender reunion between mother and son, a moment so private and precious that they all instinctively looked away, giving them what privacy they could. When the soldier emerged some time later, his eyes were red but his smile was radiant. "She's asking for you," he said, looking at Mrs. Chen and the general. "She wants to meet the people who helped her son get home." They entered the recovery room quietly. The mother lay amid a network of monitors and tubes, but her eyes were clear and alert. Despite her obvious fatigue, she radiated the same quiet dignity they had come to know in her son. "So," she said softly, reaching for Mrs. Chen's hand, "you're the guardian angel who gave up her first-class seat?" There was a knowing twinkle in her eyes that made Mrs. Chen blush. "Actually," Mrs. Chen admitted, glancing at the general, "I didn't. I'm ashamed to say I refused at first. Your son's dignity and the general's wisdom helped me remember who I used to be, who I should be." The mother's grip tightened slightly on her hand. "Sometimes our worst moments lead us to our best ones," she said. "In my classroom, I always tell my students that it's not about never making mistakes, it's about what we learn from them." The general stepped forward, introducing himself formally. The mother's eyes widened in recognition of his rank, but her smile remained warm and genuine. "Thank you for looking after my boy," she said. "He tries so hard to be strong all the time." "Your son represents the finest qualities of our service," the general replied. "But more importantly, he represents the finest qualities you instilled in him as a mother and teacher." A nurse came in to check vitals, and they could see the mother fighting to stay awake despite her exhaustion. As they prepared to leave, she called Mrs. Chen back for a moment. "The jade pendant," she said softly, "it was from your mother?" Mrs. Chen nodded, emotion catching in her throat. "Then you must take it back," the mother insisted. "I can see it carries precious memories. I have all the luck I need right here, my son home safe, and all these wonderful people looking after us." But Mrs. Chen shook her head. "Keep it," she whispered. "Think of it as a bridge between two mothers who dedicated their lives to others. My mother would have wanted that." Outside the recovery room, the waiting area had transformed again. Someone had brought coffee and sandwiches. The businessman was still there, now joined by his wife who had flown in from Los Angeles after hearing the story. The flight attendant had changed into civilian clothes but showed no signs of leaving. Word of their story had begun to spread through the hospital. Other families in the waiting room had shared it on social media, and messages of support were pouring in from across the country. A local news reporter had caught wind of the story and was respectfully requesting interviews, which the general firmly but politely declined. Some moments were too precious to be turned into headlines. Mrs. Chen sat in a quiet corner, composing an email she never thought she'd write. She was reaching out to her board of directors, not with apologies for her absence, but with a proposal. She wanted to establish a foundation in her mother's name, providing support for teachers who went above and beyond for their students, just like the soldier's mother had done throughout her career. The businessman and his wife were deep in conversation with the soldier about practical matters. They had connections with a contractor who could help modify the mother's house for her recovery period. The flight attendant was coordinating with her colleagues about regular check-ins during their San Francisco layovers. As evening approached, the general received a call that made him smile. The base commander had arranged for a small unit of soldiers to help prepare the mother's house for her return, installing safety rails, setting up a recovery room on the ground floor, even planning to tend her beloved garden while she recovered. What started as a simple act of kindness, or initial lack thereof, on a morning flight had spawned a web of compassion that seemed to grow with each passing hour. The mother's influence as a teacher had touched countless lives over the years, and now those ripples were returning as waves of support. Mrs. Chen found herself thinking about all the first-class flights she had taken over the years, surrounded by luxury but isolated from genuine human connection. Now, sitting in a hospital waiting room with her designer suit wrinkled and her makeup long since worn off, she felt richer than she ever had in her executive suite. The soldier moved among them, thanking everyone, his military bearing now softened by exhaustion and gratitude. Each person he spoke with had the same response: they were the ones who should be thanking him and his mother for reminding them of the real meaning of service and community. As the day shifted into evening, they began making plans for the days ahead. The businessman and his wife offered their guest house for the soldier to use during his extended leave. The general had arranged for daily updates to be sent to the entire unit about their honorary mother's recovery. Mrs. Chen was already thinking about how to support the school during their beloved teacher's absence. A young nurse approached their group, smiling shyly. "I just wanted you all to know," she said, "that your story has spread through the hospital. We've had 3 other people give up their private rooms today for patients in greater need. Kindness really is contagious." The general nodded approvingly. "That's how real change happens," he said. "Not through grand gestures or official policies, but through individual hearts being touched and transformed." Mrs. Chen reached for her phone, scrolling through her contact list until she found her assistant's number. It was time to make some permanent changes to her travel policies. First-class seats, she realized, meant nothing if you wasn't first class where it really mattered, in how you treated others. The days following the surgery unfolded like chapters in an unexpectedly beautiful story. The mother's recovery progressed steadily, surpassing even the doctor's optimistic predictions. Her hospital room had become something of a command center for their growing network of support, with a constant stream of visitors bringing not just flowers and cards, but promises of help and lasting friendship. Mrs. Chen found herself visiting daily, usually during her newly established humanity hours, a period she had blocked off in her calendar for activities that nourished the soul rather than the bottom line. Her office had initially been shocked by her transformation, but as she explained her experience to her board of directors, something remarkable happened. They didn't just understand, they wanted to be part of it. 1 week after the surgery, Mrs. Chen stood in the mother's classroom, surveying the empty desks and walls covered with student artwork. She had come to see firsthand the place where so many young lives had been shaped. The school principal had tearfully shared stories of how this dedicated teacher had spent her own money on supplies for students who couldn't afford them, stayed late to tutor struggling learners, and never gave up on anyone. That afternoon, Mrs. Chen made an announcement that would change countless lives. Her company would be establishing the Heart of Teaching Foundation, named in honor of both her mother and the soldier's mother. The foundation would provide resources for teachers who went above and beyond, ensuring that no educator would have to choose between helping their students and paying their bills. The general had become a regular fixture at the hospital as well, often bringing young soldiers with him. "These visits are more valuable than any leadership training we could provide," he explained to the mother, who would listen intently to each soldier's story, offering the same warmth and wisdom she gave her students. The businessman and his wife had transformed their initial offer of temporary housing into something more permanent. They were renovating a small guest cottage on their property, ensuring it would be perfect for the mother's recovery and comfortable enough for the soldier during his visits home. "Consider it an investment in humanity," the businessman said, echoing words that had become something of a motto for their group. The flight attendants' meal train had evolved into a full-scale community support system. Local restaurants, hearing the story, had begun contributing meals. The airline crew members stopping by during layovers brought specialty dishes from different cities, turning each visit into a cultural exchange that the mother particularly enjoyed. Perhaps most touching were the actions of her students. Despite being on medical leave, she insisted on receiving regular updates about their progress. When they learned of her surgery and the remarkable story behind her son's arrival, they organized their own support system. Every day, a different student would arrive with handmade cards from the class, recordings of their achievements, and updates on their projects. One afternoon, a young student arrived clutching a jar full of carefully folded paper cranes. "We learned about the Japanese tradition that folding 1,000 cranes can grant a wish," she explained shyly. "Our whole class is working on them for you. We're already at 476. Mrs. Chen, who happened to be present during this visit, found herself deeply moved by the scene. Here was the real measure of wealth, not in designer suits or first-class seats, but in the love and gratitude of young hearts touched by kindness. The mother's recovery room had become a testament to this outpouring of love. Alongside the medical equipment stood handmade gifts from students, cards from airline crew members, and even a small garden started by the soldiers who visited. The jade pendant Mrs. Chen had given her son now hung beside the bed, catching sunlight and sending green reflections dancing across the walls. The soldier, watching his mother's increasingly steady recovery, had found his own life transformed. The base commander, inspired by the story, had created a new program allowing service members more flexibility to care for family members during medical emergencies. They were calling it the First Class Family Initiative, a name that brought a knowing smile to everyone involved in its inspiration. Mrs. Chen's transformation had perhaps been the most profound. She still ran her company with efficiency and skill, but her metrics for success had fundamentally shifted. Her board meetings now included updates on community impact alongside profit margins. Her first-class airline tickets were often donated to military families in need of emergency travel. One morning, as she sat with the mother during a physical therapy session, Mrs. Chen shared something she had never told anyone. "I used to measure my success by how far I'd risen above my beginnings," she admitted. "Now I realize that true success is about how many people you bring with you on the journey." The mother, taking a brief rest between exercises, squeezed her hand. "That's the lesson I've tried to teach all my students," she said softly. "Every time we lift others, we rise a little higher ourselves." Their story had begun to spread beyond their immediate circle, not through press releases or social media campaigns, but through quiet retellings that inspired similar acts of kindness. Other business travelers started giving up their first-class seats to military personnel. Teachers across the country received anonymous donations from people inspired by the Heart of Teaching Foundation. The general, observing all of this during one of his regular visits, summed it up perfectly: "Sometimes the greatest battles we win aren't on any battlefield, but in those moments when we choose to put others before ourselves. And sometimes the greatest leaders aren't those with the highest rank or biggest office, but those who show us through their quiet example how to be better humans." As the mother grew stronger each day, their impromptu family grew stronger too. What had started as a chance encounter on a flight had blossomed into a network of caring that defied traditional boundaries of class, profession, and circumstance. They were no longer strangers brought together by a crisis, they had become a living testament to the power of human connection and the ripple effects of kindness. 1 year later, the mother's classroom was once again filled with the eager faces of students, but today was different. Instead of math problems or literature discussions, the room was hosting a special ceremony. The Heart of Teaching Foundation was celebrating its first anniversary, and the classroom where it all began seemed the perfect location. Mrs. Chen stood at the front of the room, looking very different from the businesswoman who had once refused to share her first-class seat. Her designer suit was still impeccable, but her demeanor had softened, carrying the warmth of someone who had found a deeper purpose in life. "A year ago," she began, addressing the packed classroom, "I thought success was measured by the seat you occupied on a plane. Today, I know it's measured by the seats you help others reach." She gestured to the mother, now fully recovered and back to teaching, who sat beaming in the front row beside her son, still in his pristine military uniform. The general, who had become a regular visitor to the school, stood at attention near the back, surrounded by a group of young soldiers who had been inspired by the story and now volunteered as mentors in the school's after-hours program. The businessman and his wife sat among the students, having become honorary grandparents to many of them through their continued support of the school's programs. The flight attendant who had witnessed it all was there too, along with several crew members who had become part of their extended family. The airline had been so moved by the story that they had created a formal program matching empty first-class seats with military personnel in emergency situations. They called it Operation First Class Heart, and its success had inspired other airlines to follow suit. "But today isn't about that flight," Mrs. Chen continued. "It's about what happened afterward. It's about how a moment of reluctance became a movement of generosity. In the past year, the Heart of Teaching Foundation has supported over 500 teachers across the country, providing resources for classrooms, emergency assistance for students in need, and support for educators going above and beyond." The mother stood up then, walking to the front of the room with the grace and dignity that had touched so many lives. The jade pendant still hung around her neck, now accompanied by a small gold heart, a gift from her students upon her return to teaching. "When my son told me about that flight," she said, her voice carrying the same warmth that had guided countless students, "I thought it was a story about getting home in time for my surgery. But it was really a story about finding our way home to our better selves." She turned to Mrs. Chen, taking her hand. "You thought you were the one who needed to change that day on the plane. But you were just remembering who you always were, your mother's daughter, someone who understood the value of lifting others up." The soldiers in the back stood a little straighter as their comrade joined his mother at the front. He had been promoted in the past year, partly due to a leadership program he had developed based on his experiences, teaching young officers about the power of humility in service beyond the battlefield. "The real heroes," he said, looking around the room, "aren't just those in uniform. They're the teachers who shape young minds, the business leaders who remember their humanity, the strangers who become family in times of need. Every person in this room represents a link in a chain of kindness that grows stronger with each passing day." The businessman stood up next, sharing how his company had transformed in the past year. Inspired by Mrs. Chen's example, they had created a corporate citizenship program that went beyond traditional philanthropy. "We learned that true profit isn't just measured in dollars," he explained, "but in the lives we touch and the communities we build." The room was filled with stories of transformation. Students shared how the foundation had provided resources their families couldn't afford. Teachers spoke about being able to focus on teaching instead of worrying about supplies. Military families told of arriving at airports to find their tickets unexpectedly upgraded during emergencies. As the ceremony continued, Mrs. Chen found herself reflecting on how much had changed. Her company was more successful than ever, but success looked different now. The quarterly reports included metrics on community impact alongside financial gains. Her board meetings often started with stories from the foundation, setting the tone for business discussions that followed. The mother's classroom had become a symbol of what was possible when people chose connection over convenience, compassion over comfort. The walls were still covered with student artwork, but now they also held photos of their extended family, soldiers mentoring students, business leaders teaching financial literacy, airline crew members sharing stories of world cultures. "We call this the Ripple Room now," the mother explained to visitors, pointing to a beautiful mural her students had created. It showed a single act of kindness creating waves that touched distant shores. Because we never know how far the effects of our choices will reach. As the ceremony drew to a close, they unveiled a new initiative. The foundation would be expanding to include a scholarship program, ensuring that students who dreamed of becoming teachers wouldn't be held back by financial constraints. The first scholarship had already been awarded to a young student who had been inspired by her teacher's story of resilience and community. The general delivered the closing remarks, his military precision softened by evident emotion. A year ago, a soldier needed to get home to his mother. Today, because of that need and how it transformed everyone it touched, countless others have found their way home, to their better selves, to their communities, to what matters most. Mrs. Chen looked around the room, at the faces of people who had become family, at the evidence of lives changed and hearts opened. The jade pendant caught the afternoon light, sending green reflections dancing across the walls just as it had in the hospital room a year ago. "My mother used to say that true success isn't about the destination, but about who we become on the journey," she said softly. "And sometimes, the most important journeys don't start with a first-class ticket, they start with a second chance to do what's right." As they gathered for a group photo, the mother whispered something that captured the essence of their shared experience. "Some people spend their whole lives searching for success in high places, never realizing that the highest achievements are found in the moments when we lift each other up." The story of a refused seat had become a testament to the power of human connection, a reminder that sometimes our worst moments can lead us to our best selves, and proof that true first-class status isn't found in the seat you occupy, but in the heart you choose to share.